I never told a soul, not because I lacked the words or the opportunity, but because some truths weigh too heavily to share, especially when you've spent a lifetime convincing yourself they no longer matter. And yet, for over 60 years, the contents of that old cedar box remained buried beneath the creaking floorboards of my mother's farmhouse in Schoharie County, New York, resting just beneath the guest room where I used to sleep as a boy, long before the war sent me across the ocean with a rifle, a uniform, and orders I never fully understood. Back in 1943, I was just a skinny kid from a dairy town, barely 20, wearing the insignia of the U.S. Army Signal Corps and carrying a transmitter the size of a suitcase assigned to the 36th Infantry Division, tasked with decoding and relaying telegrams from the front to command and back again, a job that seemed simple on the surface, but turned increasingly complex the more I realized what those telegrams truly represented. Each word, each number, each code, string a thread in a much larger fabric of decisions that moved entire battalions like chess pieces, often without their knowledge, and sometimes, tragically, without mercy. It was in the mountains of Italy, in the hell that was Monte Cassino, that I received the first telegram that didn't sit right. Not because it was garbled or encrypted beyond understanding, but because its content made my stomach turn. It ordered one company to withdraw under cover of night, leaving another exposed on the ridge without reinforcements, without supplies, and, as I would learn, without a chance in hell. And though I wasn't supposed to read the contents, only pass them along, I did read it, and the name of the company left behind burned into me because my best friend since basic, Jimmy Callahan, was in that unit. I relayed the order as I was trained to do, with no inflection, no hesitation, just my voice over the line, flat, official, and devastating. And by the next morning, the company was gone, and so was Jimmy, and I kept that telegram, not because I needed a reminder, but because I couldn't bear the thought that no one would ever know it wasn't a mistake, that someone somewhere had signed off on that choice, had calculated the loss as acceptable and sent it my way, trusting I would deliver it without question. I delivered it, and I kept the paper. Over the following months, more telegrams came, some clear, others vague, but a few with quiet orders tucked between lines, decisions that felt more political than tactical, names erased or repositioned like numbers on a ledger. And though I burned many for safety's sake, I kept the ones that haunted me. The order that doomed Jimmy, the scribbled message I wasn't supposed to receive from a nurse in Anzio who said she was carrying my child, the notes that pointed toward decisions no one dared admit. And when I came home in '46 to a country already reshaping the story of the war to suit the headlines, I buried those pieces of paper, and with them I buried a version of myself I didn't know how to live with. Now, all these decades later, the farmhouse is coming down. Time, termites, and developers don't care about memories. And when my grandson called to say they'd found a box beneath the floorboards with military markings and brittle old pages stamped "confidential," I knew exactly what they had uncovered, though I told him I had no idea because I wasn't ready, not then, to revisit what I had locked away so long ago. But last night I opened the drawer beside my bed, pulled out a letter I'd written to no one in particular nearly 30 years ago, and reread it under the amber light of a lamp I hadn't turned on in months. And as the words poured back into me, I realized that time doesn't erase anything. It just waits, and maybe I've waited long enough. If this story moves you the way it moved me to finally write it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that deserve to be heard. Now, take a deep breath, because what comes next will change everything. If there's one thing the war taught me, it's that silence can be more lethal than any bullet, and that not every death comes with a scream. Some arrive through static, sealed envelopes, or code sequences that, when decoded, quietly dismantle entire platoons without a single word ever spoken aloud. I learned this not in a textbook or during training, but in the damp, smoke-laced hills above the Rapido River, where the fog never fully lifted, and where voices traveled further in whispers than in shouts, because we all understood, deep down, that sometimes the truth was best left hanging in the air, half-finished, unclaimed, untraceable. I remember the exact moment I received the message that changed me, though I've spent most of my life trying to forget the details. It was mid-February 1944, and we were entrenched outside a small, nameless ridge a few miles from Monte Cassino. Our radios were barely functioning, jammed with chatter from every sector, and I was trying to keep a line open to Battalion HQ while simultaneously running the codes that had come in earlier that morning. Most were typical: troop movements, supply requests, casualty updates, the kind of routine horror that passed through your hands like sand, coarse, painful, but too constant to hold. Then the coded message came through, 10 digits, followed by a priority tag, then a final encryption that flagged it as eyes only, no relay, no copies. I should have passed it directly to the officer, just as I had been trained to do, just as I had done 100 times before. But I didn't. I broke protocol. Maybe because something about the message felt wrong, maybe because I was tired, or maybe because somewhere deep in my gut, I knew that once I opened it, I would never again be able to pretend that my role in this war was simply mechanical. I decoded it slowly, carefully, watching the letters form into words that shouldn't have been put together. Withdraw Alpha Company. Effective 0200 hours. Do not reinforce Ridge 9. Loss acceptable. Just 12 words, cold, and at that moment I knew that Ridge 9 meant the high ground where Jimmy's unit had been holding for nearly 5 days, without rest, without backup, and with dwindling ammunition. I'd written to him 2 nights before. A quick note slipped in with supply manifests, telling him I'd try to come by if our units crossed paths. I didn't know that would be the last time I'd write his name. I should have stopped the message, jammed the line, faked a failure, something. But I didn't. I relayed it exactly as instructed, my voice steady, my tone flat. I remember how my hands didn't shake, and that scared me more than anything, because it meant I had already accepted what I was doing. That part of me had already learned how to survive by complying. And when the order was acknowledged and I heard the response, copy Alpha pulling back, I felt nothing, not sorrow, not guilt, just a hollow stillness that settled in my chest like ash. Jimmy was dead the next morning. No one officially confirmed it to me. I just knew. I heard it in the silence that followed the next radio sweep. I saw it in the casualty numbers that didn't include names. I felt it in the way the wind shifted when our own troops marched past the ridge, now soaked in blood, now just another bump in a landscape that refused to remember. I kept the telegram. I shouldn't have. But I folded it once, twice, then slid it into the pocket of my field jacket and never showed it to anyone. Not because I wanted to expose anyone later, not because I believed I'd ever find justice for Jimmy. I kept it because I needed some proof, some tangible thing that confirmed I hadn't imagined it. That someone, somewhere had made that call, and I, with my clear voice and clean hands, had carried it out like a good soldier. For years, that piece of paper followed me. First in the pocket of my duffel bag, then tucked between pages of a notebook, then, finally, locked in that cedar box under the floorboards. I would look at it from time to time, always in secret, always in silence, as if it could still hurt someone, or as if admitting it existed would somehow reopen wounds that never truly healed. I married. I raised a family. I coached Little League. I volunteered at the VFW, and still, every now and then I'd hear a sound, a tone on the radio, the snap of a paper, and be right back on that ridge, holding Jimmy's death order in my hands. People think the hardest part of war is what you see. But for me, it was always what I heard. The words, the codes, the orders that didn't sound like violence but were. Silence, I've come to believe, is not just what remains after the noise of war ends, space where the truth hides. And for me, that silence became the only thing I knew how to leave behind. A silence I passed down unknowingly, to my children, who grew up sensing something they could never name. That's what I mean when I say silence is a legacy, one I never meant to leave. It was a cold night in January of 1944, the kind that made your bones ache even before you stepped outside, the kind where the air felt too still, like the world itself was holding its breath. And I remember that night, not because of the gunfire or the movement of troops or any combat mission we'd been briefed on, but because of a single telegram, unlike any other I'd received. Not from a commanding officer, not from battalion headquarters, but from someone who, by all rights, shouldn't have had access to a secure military channel at all. Her name was Margaret Kelly, though to me she was just Maggie, and I'd met her 2 months earlier in a mobile medical unit just outside Anzio, where the wounded came in faster than the cots could be cleaned, where the smell of iodine and blood mixed with salt air from the sea. And even then, amidst the chaos, she'd moved with a kind of quiet strength that made the world slow down, even if just for a moment. She was a nurse, part of the 33rd Field Hospital, with freckles that only showed in sunlight and a laugh that somehow didn't sound out of place among the cries and coughing of dying men. I never meant for anything to happen. Not there. Not then. We were both serving, both exhausted, both wary of promises made in foxholes. But the nights were long, and the human heart has a way of reaching out when it's most vulnerable. And over cups of instant coffee and shared cigarettes behind the mess tent, something grew between us. Something unsaid, but undeniable. I never called it love, not then. I barely even called it real. Cold. But it was enough to pull my thoughts back to her, even when I was 20 miles away, covered in mud and wondering if I'd live to see another letter. Which brings me back to that night in January. I was off duty, but still close to the radio post, half reading a tattered copy of The Grapes of Wrath by the dim light of a lantern, when I heard the static shift, followed by a brief transmission on an emergency channel. I assumed it was a misfire or a code from another unit bleeding through the frequency, but the tone was off, softer, almost hesitant. And when I decoded it, my hands went cold. I'm pregnant. It's yours. Please don't disappear. No rank, no signature, just those words. But I didn't need a signature. I knew it was Maggie. Somehow, she'd managed to access the emergency frequency, probably through a sympathetic radio tech or a stolen moment near it. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was something no one in their right mind would do. And yet, there it was. A message more personal than any love letter I had ever received, wrapped in encryption, delivered through a line meant for casualty reports and artillery requests. I didn't know what to do. We'd never talked about a future. Hell, we barely talked about the past. Everything between us lived in the now, in the shared glances across crowded aid stations, in the way her hand lingered just a second longer when she passed me a bandage. And yet here she was, speaking into the one part of my world I'd kept separate from emotion, the radio. And suddenly it all became too real. She was engaged. That was the truth I'd tried to ignore. Before the war, back in Philadelphia, she'd been promised to a Navy officer named Collins. She told me once in a low, sad voice that she wasn't sure she still loved him, that the war had changed her, made her see things differently. But she never said she was going to end it. And now this. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not over military channels. I didn't even know where she was stationed anymore. The field hospitals moved constantly, shadows behind the front lines. All I could do was write a letter I'd never send, one I folded, sealed, and buried at the bottom of my pack. Like it might answer something just by existing, and I kept the telegram. I wrapped it in a piece of gauze, the same gauze she once used to bind a cut on my palm after I'd fumbled with a rusted receiver, and tucked it deep into the pouch where I kept my personal papers. It stayed with me through every march, every bombardment, every long night when I wondered not just whether I'd live, but whether I'd ever see her again. The war ended. We came home. And I never found her. I tried. For months, I wrote to old friends, to the hospital unit, even to addresses I found in army logs, but she was gone. No forwarding address, no returned letters. It was as if she'd been swallowed by history. And as for the child, my child, I never knew if it was born, if it survived, if it grew up believing another man was its father, or if it ever even knew my name. That uncertainty has followed me all my life. Every birthday, every family reunion, every photograph of someone with familiar eyes. I've wondered, I've asked the question only in silence. Is there someone out there walking around with half my face, half my heart, never knowing? I never told my wife. I never told my children. Because how could I? This wasn't just a secret. It was a wound, a quiet, private ache that pulsed every time I opened that cedar box and saw the fragile telegram. The one that had once broken every rule just to tell me something no man at war is ever ready to hear. And yet, if I could go back, I wouldn't destroy it. Because even though the war took Maggie from me, that message was the one moment in the entire war that reminded me I was still alive. It happened on a Thursday morning, one of those grey, unremarkable days that blends into the calendar unless something shatters the stillness. And for me, that something was a phone call, not from a doctor or a neighbor or some old army buddy I hadn't spoken to in years, but from my grandson Ben, whose voice has always had this steady, grounded tone, even when he was a boy asking impossible questions I never knew how to answer. I picked up the phone expecting the usual, a check-in, maybe a weather report, maybe something about his kids or his job. But his first words were, "Grandpa, did you ever hide anything in the old farmhouse?" Just like that, the past wasn't the past anymore. I froze, coffee mug in hand, a Sunday crossword spread out on the kitchen table in front of me, and for a second I couldn't even speak, because somewhere deep inside I knew exactly what he had found, and I knew that this moment, the one I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, had finally arrived, not with a knock at the door, not with sirens or formal letters, but with the casual curiosity of a grandson who had no idea what he was unearthing. He told me the construction crew had started tearing up the floor in the guest room, the one that always creaked near the closet, as part of the full remodel. The place had been empty for years, and the new owners wanted to preserve the structure but modernize the rest. That's when one of the workers hit something hollow beneath the boards, and after a bit of prying and dust, they found the cedar box. "It's full of old army documents," Ben said. "Some of them look serious. Classified, maybe." I wanted to lie. I wanted to say I didn't know what he was talking about, that maybe it had belonged to someone else, some relative long gone, maybe even my father who served in the First World War. I even opened my mouth to say it, but the words didn't come. Instead, I just sat there staring at the linoleum pattern on the kitchen floor, thinking how strange it was that after all this time, something I buried when I was barely a man had decided, all on its own, that it was done being hidden. "I'll come by tomorrow," I finally said, my voice thinner than I expected, like the air had changed inside my lungs. "Bring the box. And Ben, don't open anything else until we talk." He didn't argue. He never does. That's the thing about him. He listens, even when he doesn't understand why it matters so much. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tracing the same cracks I've stared at for 30 years, remembering the exact weight of that cedar box in my hands, the way the paper smelled, musty, ink-stained, laced with secrets. I hadn't touched it in over a decade, but I could still feel it. Still see the neat folds of the telegrams, the handwritten letters I never mailed, the message from Maggie, the one that once set my heart racing and now made it ache with a kind of grief I couldn't name. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I got up, turned on the lamp at my desk, and pulled out a sealed envelope from the bottom drawer. Inside was a letter I'd written to Ben when he was barely a teenager, a just-in-case kind of letter, full of words I didn't think he'd ever read. It was more confession than explanation, but I'd written it in a moment of clarity, back when I thought I might not live long enough to speak the truth out loud. That night, I reread it twice, fixed a few things, then set it on the table. When he arrived the next day, I didn't know what to expect. Questions, maybe, or disbelief, or even disappointment. But he just sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the box between us, still closed, and waited. I slid the envelope across to him, nodded once, and watched as he opened it. His hands were steady, his eyes moved slowly across the pages. He didn't interrupt, he didn't ask anything. When he finished, he looked at me for a long moment, then stood, walked around the table, and hugged me. Hard. It wasn't the kind of hug you give someone out of pity or obligation. It was the kind that says, "I see you now, all of you." And when he finally spoke, all he said was, "You saved more than you hurt. Now let's make sure it counts." That broke something in me. Not in a painful way, more like a dam finally giving way under years of pressure, not flooding, just releasing. I'd spent so long believing that silence was a form of protection, a way to keep the world from cracking open under the weight of what I'd done and what I'd failed to do. But in that moment, I understood that silence had become its own kind of harm, passed down like an heirloom no one asked for. Ben took the box and made copies of everything. He reached out to a local historian, someone from the university, who almost fell out of his chair when he realized what he was looking at. Not just old telegrams, but a personal archive of decisions, names and moments that had never made it into the history books. He called it an ethical record, something that gave voice to the cost of war, not measured in medals or victories, but in men. In memory. Some of those papers will be displayed in a war museum in Albany later this year, and I'll be there. Not because I want recognition, but because someone should stand beside those papers and say, "This happened, these choices were made, and we are still learning how to live with them." Now the box is no longer hidden, no longer buried beneath floorboards, no longer sealed beneath silence or shame, but instead rests behind glass, carefully lit in the quiet Albany, surrounded by plaques and photos and maps with red strings tracing battle lines across oceans. It sits there, unassuming to most, just a cedar box with a small brass lock and a few folded papers inside, and yet to me, it contains the entire weight of a life lived with the burden of knowing, remembering, and, finally, telling. People walk past it every day. Some stop to read the description, some barely glance. But every now and then, someone lingers, someone leans in, someone reads the faded text of one of the telegrams or the handwritten note I left beside it. And I like to think, or maybe just hope, that in that moment, they feel a fraction of what I carried. Not the guilt, not the regret, but the complexity. The impossible tightrope between duty and doubt, between obedience and conscience, between silence and truth. I don't know what happened to Maggie. I never found her, never found the child she carried. If the child was born, if it survived, if it lived long enough to ask where it came from. I've spent years wondering if there's a man or woman out there with my eyes, my stubborn jaw, maybe the same way of thinking too long before speaking. Someone who grew up never knowing they had a father decoding battlefield orders under foreign stars, holding on to one telegram like it was a lifeline to a different future. And Jimmy, he remains in the past, on that ridge, in that silence. I carry him still. Every morning I wake up and see the light hit my window at the same angle it did the day I left for basic, and I think of him, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a friend I failed. Not by betraying him, but by never speaking his name until it was too late. But maybe now, finally, that silence has done what it was meant to do, not just to bury pain, but to preserve memory long enough to be passed on. Ben has started collecting oral histories from other veterans. He says my story was just the beginning. That maybe, just maybe, the things we were too afraid to say are the very things the next generation needs to hear most. And as for me, I've stopped hiding, not just the papers, but the parts of myself I thought were better left untold. Because I've come to understand that the truth, even when it hurts, even when it trembles in your throat, is not a weapon. It's a bridge. It connects us across decades, across families, across generations, and reminds us that survival isn't just about living through war. Sometimes it's about learning how to live after it. So if you ever find yourself in that museum and you see the box, stop. Look. Ask yourself what stories are hidden inside your own family's silence. Because we all carry boxes, some of them made of cedar, some of them just memory, but all of them waiting for someone brave enough to open them. We share new stories every day, real voices,